welcome, Rhiannon, to today's session. This session will be looking at how Rhiannon and the volunteers teams at ZSL have responded to a second COVID-19 pandemic lockdown, which is currently for 4 weeks in England. I'll hand over to you, Rhiannon. Thank you, and I'm looking forward to hearing how you've been responding to it.
Perfect. Hi everyone. I'm going to attempt to share my screen now, but I'm not a technical whiz like Will, so fingers crossed this works. Okay, so can everyone see my screen with the presentation on it? Will, can you give me a yay or a nay? Perfect. All right. So what I'm going to talk to you a little bit about today is kind of what ZSL has done around locking down the first time, what we learned from that, but I guess then thinking about the current lockdown and where we go from here. I suspect a lot of what I say isn't going to be rocket science to you, but hopefully it will help to reassure you that you're not alone, but also to give you a very warts and all view of kind of what we've done and what's worked and what hasn't as well. So here we go. So in advance, just apologies, my presentation is a wee bit text heavy because whilst I could have put loads of animals in here for you, it doesn't really relate to lockdown per se. So I hope you'll bear with me in terms of the words. All right, so who are we? So ZSL, I bandied around, but we are a conservation charity, the Zoological. And our vision is a world where wildlife thrives, so quite a large one there. We have 2 zoos, so mainly what I'm going to be talking about today in terms of the redeployment of volunteers, I'm going to be talking about our 2 zoos, because that's really the main thing, the main area that we've got visitor-facing volunteers in. So just a fact for you, so London Zoo is the oldest scientific zoo in the world, which is pretty cool. Opened in 1828. And it has around 14 hectares, which is actually really, really small when you think about our sister zoo up in Bedfordshire, which is 243 hectares, huge compared. But we've only got over 20,000 animals, but we've also got a huge conservation programme, and you'll have heard, I'm sure, of some of the work that we do. One Less in particular is quite a big campaign for us. It's around reducing the amount of disposable plastic we use, particularly around water bottles. And then one of the more recent sort of conservation successes we had was reintroducing this amazing, I'm not massively into snails, I have to say, but these are quite beautiful partula snails into French Polynesia. Previously they were extinct in that area, so that's pretty cool. And we also have a world-renowned research centre which does a lot of stuff around science. So the reason I wanted to say that is just to say that ZSL is about more than just its 2 zoos. But that's mainly what I'll focus on today. And just in terms of sort of scale, we have around 600 UK-based staff and about 750 volunteers at the moment. We just went through a massive recruitment campaign. All right, so moving on into lockdown number 1. If I can get my screen to move, hold on 1 second, there we are. So lockdown 1, obviously back in March, what we did, if everyone can remember that far ago, in England we had sort of news of the virus, and it was sort of, we had drip feed of information from the government around vulnerable people, and so what we did was we had a phased suspension of our volunteering activity according to need from the organisation and who we were talking about within the volunteering team. And then we finally closed our doors on something like the 23rd of March. 2/3 of our volunteering team, so I'm volunteer manager at ZSL, so I have oversight of volunteering across all of our activity. And then I have 2 colleagues based in Whipsnade and London Zoo that are part of my team, and then various other colleagues with responsibility to volunteer management. Those 2 volunteer coordinators were furloughed through April and June. And I guess during that first lockdown, it was then reliant on me keeping in touch with our volunteer teams. And so it was mainly around newsletters. You can see an example of our newsletter there. Some coffee mornings, Q&As with our animal teams, and because it fell during that period, quite a lot of volunteering activities such as blogs and getting input from our volunteering team, including photos of what they'd learned, what they'd been doing during that first lockdown. I think one of the things that we really realised at that time was that there wasn't necessarily a huge demand for social activity during that lockdown, because the structure of our teams pre the first lockdown was that they all were quite independent, they were quite social with one another, and therefore they carried on doing that. And actually what they wanted from us as an organisation was updates about the organisation and the animals, rather than facilitated social activities. So it was relatively straightforward for us, but obviously quite a long time, 3 months, to keep people engaged and occupied. So in terms of preparing for that first return to opening, so I don't know whether you guys know, obviously zoos are slightly different to museums, but actually more similar than you'd think. We had 5 days notice from the government to reopen, which was a weird blur for me, if I can remember. 2 of those days fell over a weekend as well, so I worked solidly for those 5 days. And we reopened then on the 15th of June. What we did in terms of ZSL was we had a gradual phased return for volunteers. So dependent upon what the needs of the organisation was, our 2 zoos primarily. So what did they need us to be able to support with upon reopening? What volunteer roles therefore could deliver and support that need? And what was the individual circumstance of the volunteers in question? And we phased that, and we outlined that very, very clearly in a redeployment fact sheet that went out to all volunteers, irrespective of position and circumstance, so that they could see what was going to happen and where we were going to go and how we were going to go there. We asked volunteers to self-declare and identify whether they were in a low, medium or high risk category based on their individual circumstance. And the higher risk volunteers, we went through a one-to-one risk assessment process before they returned. We also had a bit of work to do to reframe our visitor experience roles in terms of a stewarding role. And this was really so that we could emphasise all of that sort of structural operational need that the zoos had over engagement. So one of the key differences for zoos versus many of your organisations as museums is that we obviously don't have gallery attendants or stewards within our spaces. People generally walk around zoos, and main people that they will encounter on their walk around are keepers who are tending to animal welfare and care, and volunteers who might be running engagement activities. So when we were thinking about reopening with social distancing, a big factor for us was how are we going to encourage people to social distance other than signage? And how are we going to monitor capacity in spaces? So for us, the volunteers was a whole new rung of engagement that we needed to put in so that they could encourage that. And so we reframed that role to be thinking about wayfinding, social distancing, safety over the engagement element. And one of the challenges that we quite quickly realised that we had was that the supply of volunteers, i.e. those that were willing to come back in those quite early days of reopening in June, whilst trying to balance our commitment to supporting people to take their time to return when they wanted to, meant actually we were unable to meet the demands of the zoo to make it COVID safe. So we had to run alongside this a major recruitment drive as well, which had its ups and downs, I guess, whilst trying to bring back our existing team. I'll talk to you about that in December though, but a really interesting time to be recruiting during a lockdown and furlough. So that's sort of what we did to prepare for reopening. I wanted to give you some images, otherwise it's a bit boring, isn't it? So we played on the whole puns around how big animals were and the footprints to try and orientate people around our zoos. So our zoos became one way, and we used the iconography of animal paw prints around the sites to indicate where people could stand and how they moved around the site. So some quite lovely images there. It wasn't always such blue skies, I'm afraid, though. It has been raining quite a lot as well in the latter months. And this is just some of the elements that I referenced earlier. So fact sheets to accompany the volunteers so they knew very clearly what we were trying to do and why, so that it was really, really clear, I guess, to all of our ZSL volunteers that they would go through the same process, irrespective of who they were. And then top right, I mentioned that we asked people to self-identify with low, moderate and high risk groups. That's just to indicate that. And at the same time, we were running a recruitment to grow our numbers exponentially, as it turns out. But we did that via a call out for help at the time. So that's just indicating that there. So what did we learn at that time? Quite a lot, to be honest. I'm still processing it, as I'm sure many of you guys are. I think one of the things that was really clear to us is that we had to, our comms all came out from one central person, me, because I was the only one unfurloughed at that time. But what that meant was that everyone, irrespective of department or role, got exactly the same comms, exactly the same information. And that was really, really helpful, because what we know, and I'm sure you do as well, is that the rumour mill starts working. It starts thinking that one group is being prioritised over another. And I didn't want any of that to undermine people's safety and their positive return. So for us, that comms coming from one central point was really, really important, and really laying it out step by step, what was going to happen, when and why, actually really reduced the amount of queries that came back as well, which is good because it was only just me doing it. The other thing I would sort of say, I've joined in a lot of these discussions around kind of how to keep your volunteer team engaged during a lockdown. And I've really come to the conclusion that it needs to be tailored to your organisation. So whilst it's great to get all those wonderful ideas from colleagues, A, you don't need to do everything, but B, you need to look at your context. So for us, as I mentioned, our volunteer teams are quite independent. They operated in a team-based system prior to lockdown, and therefore they just carried on as before. So their sort of coffee mornings, they ran themselves. I tried to run a few coffee mornings and find it would be me and one or two others. So for us, it was very much about listening to them about what they needed, rather than sort of foisting a load of stuff on them that perhaps they didn't want. The other thing that I quickly realised was that whilst that risk assessment process for bringing back our more vulnerable colleagues was great, and it was very supportive, and it really ticked our health and safety boxes as an organisation, gosh, it was slow, and it was really quite admin heavy. So I think if I were to do something like that, it would need to be much more automated going forward, and thinking about actually the balance between supportive and quick, because ultimately it ended up slowing down the return for some of our volunteers, which wasn't great either. So a lot to be learnt there. The other thing that I've learnt this time and in lockdown 2 is that our senior team was quite quick to advise on how to lock down and close up shop, so to speak, but less guided on how to return. So I found that initiative was really required by our team to think about actually how are we going to support them to come back. So the irony being that's probably the area that needed most sensitivity, and we felt a little bit like we were out on a limb doing that, and particularly because zoos were quite early on in organisations' return to opening. The other challenge I found was I had great aspirations during lockdown 1 to develop new remote volunteering options, and then realised that half the people I needed to make any of them work weren't there anymore because they were on furlough. So it sounds a bit silly to say, but it took me a long time to learn it. I need to get ahead before lockdown 3, because I didn't learn it even before between 1 and 2 even. So next time we're open, I'm getting straight on the remote stuff for then. And then the last thing I'd like to say on lockdown 1 that I'm still having to tell myself is, whatever you do and however well planned, this is a very anxious time for us and for the people that we're working with, and they will potentially be unhappy with whatever you do. I have never experienced as many complaints and challenging feedback as I have during this period. And that's, I think, because of how challenging life is just for people at the moment. And so really, really telling myself not to take it. And I would really say the same thing to you guys as well. All right, so lockdown 2. So for us, lockdown 2 obviously started on Thursday in England. So the decision was taken by our senior management team to suspend all on-site volunteering activity. Very clear, very easy in some ways. We then sent our team-wide comms out, and it was very very clear as to how we delivered those comms consistently. And again, we had, you know, sentiments of wishing that things could continue, but understanding on the whole from the team. So what we're planning to do for this month is building on what worked previously for us. So the weekly communications were really, really important for us. I had one volunteer come back to me and say, I felt more informed about what was going on at ZSL by being a volunteer than I did being furloughed from my day job in another type of organisation, which for me, I will always remember. So that's really, really important for us. Coffee mornings for those who want them, but also we're running more of those talks about ZSL's work that we knew worked last time. But also we are taking this opportunity to catch up again. It was hell for leather when we reopened, and so we are not going to go on furlough for the time being in November, and then we'll see how we get on. In terms of preparing for reopening, a lot of the groundwork is already done, in my view, for when we hopefully reopen in December. I guess by the time that we entered lockdown 2, our zoos had opened up 95% of what it was planning to open up. And volunteers were involved from day 1 of that. And so actually we've had time to test what volunteers can be involved in, what works, what doesn't. And so we have modelled what it might look like to open up in December, with no tier being in tier 1 and tier 2, but we've done it all before. So actually we've already got the working there ready for how we would deploy volunteers. The only unknown slightly would be if we opened in tier 3, but we have got a plan for that, so we would be prepared. And I think the other thing is that we are already getting ahead of ourselves. We've already asked for availability for reopening. And in our view, if everyone who was comfortable volunteering just prior to lockdown is happy to do so again, then actually they can bypass that process that we put in place the first time, because it's all still there and relevant, and they will return straight into volunteering again upon receipt of any new guidance. But ultimately, most of those volunteers have been through those iterations of how we might see ourselves opening up in December again. And for me, again, I've said it before, but the clear communications are really, really key. So it'll take my team and myself just to be really, really on it in terms of any comms that comes out to staff, and making sure that it's relevant, and thinking about the implications for volunteers, because what I definitely know is that the organisation probably won't do that. That lands on our doorstep to make sure it's relevant for our volunteers coming back. So a couple of what ifs. So for us, if we do leave lockdown into tier 3, now we haven't been into tier 3 down south yet, then ZSL is modelling what this would look like in the cost analysis of opening in different ways, including outdoor only options. But the volunteer role that we've got, that is the main role that's on site at the moment, which is that stewarding, social distancing, reminding role, can be scaled up and down, and it has been to various degrees already. So that makes it relatively straightforward for us. If the lockdown continues, then obviously we stay closed, and it's likely that we will look at increasing our engagement activity, and we'll escalate thinking about remote volunteering as well. So outstanding questions for us, and I'm sure, and I hope anyway, that many of you have some of these questions as well. But these are things that I'm starting to think about and thinking forward, which is sort of, once social distancing is less of an issue, do we revert back? In all likelihood, I think we'll pick the best bits from both structures and go forward that way. How far do we take our responsibility to redeploy people? So actually, it's been quite challenging. I think I'd need to create new roles to redeploy some of our volunteers. I haven't quite got my head around kind of what that looks like yet, but do I need to do that? Or actually is my responsibility then to think about, are there other places those people could volunteer? So it might be a bit of signposting as well. This one I've mentioned to a few colleagues already, but how long do we support volunteers who at the moment understandably don't want to return? But if COVID-19 is with us for the next year, year and a half, do we need to make some difficult decisions before then, or do we continue to support them during that time in limited resources? And at the end, I think the longer term question is around the culture change that we will see at our organisations. We've already seen a huge culture change, and the where volunteering sits within the organisation is starting to move already. So I would say that that's going to continue, but it'd be interesting to see what it's like sector-wide at the end. So huge thank you for me for listening. I'm happy to take some questions at the end, but I'll stop sharing my screen now and hand over to Will again.
Brilliant. Thank you for that whistle-stop tour through bringing back volunteers and then sending them home again, and all the craziness in between. It must have been an incredibly busy time for you. We've got a quick moment for a couple of questions now before we go into our next talk. I was just going to say, with your volunteers coming back, are you, for example, at Candine Museum, we've had to readjust all of our surveys because they're now all outdated, because we didn't ever reopen, so we never were able to collect the data we intended. Are you planning to update your surveys for volunteers who haven't returned yet?
To be honest, probably not. So one of the things that we did just before the lockdowns were being reconsidered for England was we got in touch with everyone who hadn't yet returned to see what their feelings were. So we sent them an individual email to say, hey guys, we noticed you haven't returned. This is the status quo. What are your thoughts? So that is already being done on an individual basis because we started that process before lockdown 2 got announced. So I think we'll probably just continue with that because we started that process off.
Great, thank you. I will do one more question now. So if you could start one remote volunteering role in December, which one would you want to trial?
Oh, that's a really good question. Whoever gave me that one, that's a really hard one. To be perfectly honest, the honest truth is that when I approached remote volunteering back in April now, there wasn't a huge amount of appetite for it from the zoo world, as in my organisation. And I think that's because we're a very practical organisation. A lot of the focus is on what is practically happening on site. So I think it's going to need to take a little bit of a kind of culture shift to start thinking, actually, what activity can be removed from the physical site and happen off-site. I don't quite know yet, but I've already arranged some calls with colleagues from BIASA. I mentioned in my presentation is the British and Irish Association of Zoos and Aquariums. So this equivalent, but for the zoo sector. So I am going to go out and basically crowdsource some ideas from those that are doing it already. So that's a very fudged answer there, Will.
Thank you, Rhiannon. And if anyone else has any questions to ask, we will be doing a short Q&A at the end of today's session as well. But in the meantime, we'll be now handing over to Laura Turnage and, one moment, and Alex Edwards. Alex is Volunteer Learning and Development Advisor at London Museum, and Laura is Secondary Schools Programme Manager at London Museum also, and they both jointly manage a Museum of London Work Experience Programme. Normally this programme would take place at the museum throughout the summer for 14 to 18-year-olds. As a result of the pandemic this year, they worked to transition the programme into an online offer for students between the ages of 14 and 18. So I'm now going to hand over to them. Welcome, thank you for coming along today. It must have been an interesting experience to change your programme and turn it to a digital programme.
It sure was, yeah. I'm just going to share my screen and get our presentation up, so hopefully everyone can see that.
Yep.
Perfect.
Laura? Yes, I'll start. So we're going to talk about a couple of different areas today. So we're going to start off with what our work experience was like, how we transitioned it into online, how we did that, what we learned from that, and then some top tips at the end. So work experience at the Museum of London is jointly managed between HR and learning. So Alex and I are essentially the work experience leads. It's an ACE funded programme, and that budget sits within ACE as sits within HR, as does the target for work experience. So our aim is to get 24 students each summer. We're quite lucky that it sits within two different strategic objectives for the organisation, which is to engage every school child and to reach more people. So it really fits quite well that it's within both. And the ultimate aim of our work experience is to kind of make that career pipeline and to start diversifying the workforce. So hopefully young people join us at work experience when they're 14 to 18-year-olds. They then transition into a volunteering role, and then they might be able to transition into a paid role. We have work experience champions that sit across each of the departments in the museum. So these might be people who are really interested in working with young people, or they want to gain more experience from managing, or they need help with extra tasks. So we're really lucky that we have about 15 departments across the museum that are already engaged and interested in work experience. And for the young people to attend, they need to attend an insight day that covers what a group induction would do for a normal employee. And the work experience champions deliver these presentations. They talk about their career pathways, and then the young people have an opportunity to talk with them with a Q&A after. And we've also piloted our work experience with SEND students and looked after young people and care leavers. These are much smaller programmes, and these often take place in the autumn term, whereas we're doing a comparison with what happened in summer term. So we just wanted to give you an example of how work experience has transitioned over the last few years. So really over the last 4 years, it's grown quite massively. And we have seen a big interest. So we've got between sort of 80 people joining us on the Insight Day and about 20 students joining us for the work experience weeks themselves. Although in 2019, we had about 40 young people join us for work experience, which is just amazing. And we did realise that maybe 40 was a bit too many, and we're going to scale that back again. But our work experience programme has really grown over the last few years. And we didn't have any aim when we transitioned to an online work experience, but just to give you an idea of the numbers, 52 young people participated in our online programme. And that was 131 attendees per session. So lots of the young people attended multiple times. To give you some context of how we were transitioning from our in-person programme into this online programme, we had already started the process of planning our 2020 work experience programme when the museum closed to the public on the March 19th. And we had about 100 young people who had expressed an interest to join us for work experience in the Insight Day. So we were already on that pathway of, it's quite a quick pathway of moving from the expressions of interest into getting to our work experience programme. But we had to have lots of meetings and lots of planning, and we had come to the conclusion quite quickly that we might be able to do sort of a hybrid programme, where some of it was online and some of it was in person. But I was going back through kind of our emails and what we were researching to start off with. So the museum closed to the public on the 19th of March, and then we had already made the decision by the 17th of April that we were abandoning our plans and we had to do something new. So at this point, we had EB sign off to kind of transition our whole programme online. And at this point, we sent through a survey to the young people, which is Alex going to talk about in a minute. And then from then, we had up until the 22nd of June, which is when the programme started, to make all those changes. So we're really proud that we managed to turn this around quite quickly. But just to give you an idea of how we went from thinking we were going to do something in person to then jump into totally online in a very short amount of time. But Alex is going to talk about what we actually did.
Alex, you're on mute. Sorry, thank you so much. I was really worried about interrupting Laura and now interrupting myself. So as Laura mentioned, we were incredibly fortunate that we'd already received applications for the Insight Day from the students. So we could send a survey out to them to find out what they wanted from these online sessions. And that way we could build the sessions around what would be most useful for them so that it was as relevant as possible. So the results from the survey showed us that everyone had access to the internet, so they'd be able to attend online sessions, because that was one of our concerns, that people may not be able to access them. The sessions should be about an hour in length. It should be a series of sessions with different content in each, rather than one long kind of big session. The sessions should take place in the afternoon, not really much surprise there with 14 to 18-year-olds. And that the top 3 topics that came up that the young people were most interested in were finding out about skills needed for working in museums, having access to speakers across a variety of museum departments, so different museum staff, and having the opportunity to do practical activities. So onto what we created. Firstly, to mention, we had a really incredible response from our work experience champions across the museum, and this resulted in us being able to offer 10 different sessions, so essentially information on 10 different parts of the museum. And we ran these on afternoons over a 3-week period. So the format that the sessions took, for the majority of sessions, it started with a presentation from the work experience champion talking about their role, the skills that they use in their role, and their career pathway, so how they got to the role that they were in. There was then a Q&A section, which gave the students a chance to ask any questions they had. And then there was a task or activity for the students to undertake. And where possible, these were to be as close to a real life work task as we could make them, and perhaps something that they would have done had they been in the museum for work experience in person. For some of the sessions though, it wasn't possible to have that activity and that real life task. So for those, we advertised them more as information sessions, but we still tried to make them as interactive as possible. So that mainly related to sessions such as like HR, a session on apprenticeships, and a session about our Memories of London programme, which is a programme of activities supporting people living with dementia. So in these sessions, students were really encouraged to participate via the chat function or using the yes and no buttons in Zoom. So we thought it might be useful to share some of the examples of the activities that the students were undertaking. So there was quite a broad range of activities. Some of the examples you can see on the screen. I'm just going to touch on a couple of them to give you a bit of further information. So our Museum Development Office, they work really closely with London's non-national museums, offering advice and support. So the task for the students here was to review one of the non-national museums' websites and social media platforms and feed back on different areas by filling in a form in a Word document. And that information could then be passed back to the non-national museums as part of the Museum Development Office's work. So a really great task that they would have done. Had they been to work experience, they probably would have gone to some of these museums in person. So a really nice kind of transition. One of our curators worked with the young people to encourage them to think about object label writing, but it was in more of a kind of a creative way. So getting the students to perhaps imagine that it was the object itself talking or telling a specific story related to the object rather than just listing what the object was and its qualities. And then our commercial services team, they had the young people looking at floor plans for events and setting up an event space with social distancing in mind. So it was very current. And they were also thinking about online public events. So things that we could run in response to our online collection and kind of sharing ideas for that as well. So we wanted to add a few other random bits of information, which I'm calling technical notes. So for anyone looking to actually kind of run something similar in future, this is kind of some more behind the scenes information and admin information, which I thought might be useful. So the platform we used to run the sessions was Zoom. As an organisation, the Museum of London, we were set up with free Zoom accounts at the beginning of the lockdown, and we were able to purchase a licence to access the longer sessions with our Arts Council funding, because we felt that Zoom would be the most accessible for the young people and offer us a choice of using breakout rooms as well, which actually in the end we didn't use, but it gave us a few more options. So our volunteer management system at the museum is Volunteer Impact. We'd used this already to collect the applications for the Insight Day. So we continued using the system and advertised the sessions through the system, and volunteers could then sign up to those sessions as well through their Volunteer Impact account. So it was a really nice way of keeping everything in a neat, nice place together. So with our work experience champions, in order to plan the sessions, we had at least 2 meetings with the work experience champions. Initially, we had one group meeting where we informed them of the results of the survey. And from there, they were asked to submit a sort of pro forma, which confirmed their availability and that the format of the session that they could offer. We then met with work experience champions individually to discuss this in more detail and flesh out their tasks. And then before the session, we had one more meeting actually on Zoom to kind of test run, go through any final questions and make sure they were happy with how their task would run, if they were doing a task. So for the tasks themselves, it kind of varied with each session. For some students, they were emailed before the session with any information that they needed for the task. And in others, they were maybe sent an email during the session. For some of them, it would have been a Word document that perhaps they were completing and emailing back to us. And for others, they may have simply popped their responses in the chat box. But in all cases, we would introduce the task on Zoom with the young people and go through it in person to ensure that everyone knew what they were doing. We did also ask the students to remain logged into Zoom while they were doing their task. And the task could have been up to 20 minutes. But they were kind of staying there so that they could ask us any questions if they had them, and we can keep them, be there for them if they needed us. And importantly, feedback on the tasks were also given to students. So they were really interested in having feedback on what they'd done. So either at the end of the session or by email afterwards, we provided feedback for their tasks. Safeguarding. So in the run up to the sessions, we spoke a lot about safeguarding because of running online sessions for young people, what we should and shouldn't be doing and how we could make it as safe as possible. So some of the things that we ended up doing were creating specific safeguarding guidance for both the students and the work experience champions. Our links to the Zoom sessions were sent out to the students the morning of the session, and they were reminded not to publish or share them with anyone else. Students were also asked to join the session with the name showing that they would have registered for. So on Zoom, their name should be the same as the name on our system, basically, and that meant that we could easily identify them in the waiting room and ensure we weren't letting anyone else in. Students could choose to have their cameras on or off. We had a process in place for what we would do if we were like Zoom bombed or lost connection, so everyone was really clear on how that would work. And we also made sure that we had 2 hosts in the session. So one would kind of be facilitating the session, and the other would be keeping an eye for any safeguarding concerns or helping with technical bits during the session. And finally, private messaging and screen sharing on Zoom were kind of turned off for extra security in that sense. And now back to Laura to talk about the impact.
So we were quite lucky in that we have a Mentimeter account at the museum. So we were able to evaluate each of the 10 sessions using Mentimeter at the end. And then a month after they participated in the online work experience, we sent them their certificates with a follow-up SurveyMonkey. And so this is just some of the results of the follow-up SurveyMonkey. So what we're really pleased to show is that we kind of met all the aims of the sessions. So those 3 things that Alex talked about at the beginning, which was talking to real people that work in museums, understanding the skills that they use and doing those tasks, were the 3 things we concentrated on from that talking from that initial survey of what they wanted. And it looks like that we did meet those kind of 3 areas. we've still got lots of work to do on what a real work task looks like over the internet, and we're still working on that, and we're actually running this online work experience again with one specific school at the moment, and even translating it onto a different platform. So we're using Google Meets this time. The tasks are taking we're using the same tasks, a different platform, and they're even harder to deliver. So there are lots of different variables when you're doing stuff online, including what platform you're using. And the other thing we just wanted to share is what the students did next. So whether they wrote it on their CV, they wrote it on their personal statement, and what they looked into, like, different opportunities that they had. So we thought these were really interesting examples of the kind of data that we have to share. We've just got a few more slides for you. So the next one is thinking about these kind of overarching lessons that we've learned. So one of the things was we really struggled to track in our evaluation what sessions are poor or average. We couldn't really get a reason as to why this was, and we think that's because it was the online setting and you can't have that conversation with a person. They were very rarely marked poor or average, but we still wanted to interrogate that a bit more. Online sessions take up way more staff time than we expected. So not only did we have 2 hosts in the session, we had the work experience champion. Some departments have up to 3 work experience champions. So in some sessions, there were 6 members of staff in that session for an hour. And there was loads of planning that went into it as well. And having repeated the same process again, the same amount of planning needs to go into it. So there's not the same repetition that you get with in-person events. So there's still the same amount of planning, whereas in person, there's less planning the next time you do it. And the students were likely to participate with their cameras off, and it was super hard to get them to unmute and to speak loud. We've managed to adapt that though, and use the chat box in kind of really interesting ways, gamifying how we use the chat box to get young people to really think about what they're saying and how to participate. And we couldn't understand the participant expectations of what they wanted from us. This was particularly clear when we were given feedback on the tasks. So we would give general feedback for some tasks and individual feedback for others, depending on what kind of task it was. And the more sessions that the young people repeated, the higher their expectations became. But in actuality, we knew nothing about their capability, about their technical equipment they had at home. So it was really difficult for us to find that standard that we should be aiming for, because we knew nothing about the young people. And obviously, because it's online, you're always going to have some problems with the internet at some point. So we've got a couple of top tips that we thought would be useful to share with you based on what we've learned. So when you are screen sharing, particularly when you're working with young people, it's really nice if you can have another member of your team in the session for safeguarding, to monitor the chat box and monitor any cameras that are on. And if you can't do that, and if you've got access to a second computer, to have that available so that you can do both at the same time, that would be great. We really found talking to our audience first was an amazing thing that we did, in that we did everything based on research and everything based on evidence from the audience. So we would really recommend talking to your audience first if you're going to try and engage them online. And finally, the biggest comment we got was to make everything interactive. And we kept trying to add more interactivity in. And we still don't know what the young people meant by make it more interactive. So we're continually trying to work towards that, but we have tried to like gamify the chat a bit. And for us, the next steps are, we're going to make the assumption that work experience is not going to be in person again for 2021. So we're now trying to think about whether we can have sort of like a hybrid or blended online and in-person kind of work experience. But we only had one meeting about that so far, so we haven't got very far at all in that planning. If you do want to know more about our work experience programme, we've had an opportunity to put it in quite a few places. So there's loads of blogs you could read about what we did. So please feel free to go and check one of these out.
Brilliant. Thank you, Alex and Laura. That was really interesting to listen to, and especially within the context of turning that around from a planned physical work experience to a digital one in a matter of months. It's a fantastic achievement. I guess one question which is coming from Rhiannon was, how do you gamify the chat? I think we all would love to know. Probably not just for the work experience, but also for meetings.
So we did things like we would start a sentence and then get everyone to finish the sentence. So the Museum of London is, and then everyone would have to put in something in the chat box. What we have found though is that if we give a time span, so you've got a minute to think of something and everyone press enter at the same time, the fear of being the first person to press enter is lost. So if you give people that break, we've done missing word activities, so the same again, but rather than the blank being at the end, the blank being in the middle. We've done things that can link people together. So when we worked with the young people, care leavers and looked after young people, we played a game called Sun Shines On, which was a bit about like finding things in common. So you could use the yes and no button to find different young people. So we've done quite a few things like that as well. Oh, and the other one we was recommended, which I've never tried, is getting people to do physical movements if their cameras are on, but I have never tried that one.
Thank you. How did the museum reach out to students? Were they London schools, like further education ones? What was your strategy for reaching out to students?
I think generally in terms of the work experience itself, quite often it's students who actively seek us out and are looking for work experience. They tend to be the ones that kind of sign up and come through for the Insight Day. So for the online working experience itself, it was anyone who had already registered for the Insight Day. Those are the ones that we kind of targeted for the online work experience. But we had to kind of get their permission again. So we contacted everyone and said, this is what we'd like to do. If you'd like to participate, please confirm back to us. And here's a survey to complete. And from there, we kind of went from there.
Brilliant, thank you. I'll give you anyone. Does anyone else have any other questions before we close today's session? I do have one more whilst we wait for any other questions. And with your planning for next year, how do you, are you planning both options, or are you planning specifically to focus on digital?
We're still deciding. We're kind of we've had one meeting to discuss it so far, and like watching the news at every opportunity. I think we're kind of in our mind almost trying to plan for lots of different scenarios and have an idea of how we could react if everything shuts down again, if it looks like we can go ahead, you know, at what date do we have to make the decisions by, and that will kind of tell us how we go forward. But it is, I think, for the Insight Day, for example, we're kind of thinking, you know, that comes first. Does that have to be in person? You know, do we need to think about doing that online? So yeah, there's kind of different considerations.
Brilliant, thank you. And I think we've got one more question on how the sessions took place. Did people have to sign up to individual, or were they all just given the invites to each session and they just chose which ones they went to?
Yeah, sure. So we advertised the sessions individually, so as individual sessions. And I think we had 10 spaces, Laura? I can't remember now. It feels so long ago. 10 spaces on each session.
I think it was 10.
Yeah. And yeah, so students could, we asked students to sign up to, say, a maximum of 2 sessions to start with, and then if there were still spaces available on others, people could then re-sign up to more sessions, just to try and make sure we had enough for everyone to attend at least 1 or 2. But yeah, they were advertised separately and people could sign up for which sessions they were interested in.
That's great. Thank you for answering the HG questions from our group today. And I'd just like to say thank you to everyone who's come along today, and thank you to Laura, Alex and Rhiannon for sharing their experiences of volunteering in a lockdown and in the second lockdown now as well. We'll be back here in a month's time on December the 8th, where we'll be joined by Rob Jackson, who will be talking about the Engage Journal. We'll also be joined by Kay Thompson, looking at influence. And Rhiannon will be back next month to talk about her talk that she was due to talk about today, but with lockdown, we asked her to talk about the impact of the lockdown on her role. So Rhiannon, recruiting volunteering in a post-COVID world. So thank you to everyone coming along today, and I hope you all have a good month, and hopefully see you as we emerge out of the lockdown. Fingers crossed. Have a good few days, everyone. Bye.